Somehow, remembering every nuance of a bad new wave hit from the early 80s that I never felt much connection to gives me more pleasure than listening to a favorite punk single I haven't listened to in a while. I know all of them from watching hours and hours of MTV in my early teens, which coincided with its emergence on cable in August of 1981, praying for Radio Clash or Rock the Casbah to come on, or Public Image, which Nina Blackwood would play every now and then. Everybody watched MTV in school, and everybody knew all the songs they played incessantly, one of the few bonding experiences I could stomach back then. The Clash's alternative stance reflected my own emerging identity back then, but now as a lifetime member of the non-mainstream community, it seems that the garbage I endured waiting for my idols to come on MTV has left a bigger impact on my psyche than I would have guessed. I squeezed a lot of listenability out of the MTV playlist, despite the fact that I never bought any records based on MTV. In fact, I was buying stuff like X, Richard Hell, MC5, The Stooges, Captain Beefheart, Public Image Limited, The Dream Syndicate, The Velvet Underground, The Sex Pistols, The Ramones, The New York Dolls, Gang of Four, and Joy Division. I knew Billy Idol had been in a punk band, Generation X, because when I was 10, my cousin had given me the book 1988 by Caroline Coon, all about the 77 British punk scene. The book scared the shit out of me at first. I literally could not look at one photo of Joey Ramone. But eventually I got familiar with all the different bands in it, and eventually interested in hearing them, starting with The Clash, who showed up on the radio with London Calling a year or two later. So right, Billy Idol. I followed his MTV career with interest. Rebel Yell and White Wedding are decent songs with faint traces of punk in them, and of course Billy's Alan Vega-derived, as I learned later, sneers and screams. Once I heard Suicide, I didn't need no Billy Idol, but that was 4 years later as a freshman in college. I knew Joan Jett from the 1988 book too. There's a picture of her with a ball and chain and wearing a t-shirt that says Sex Pistols on it. Her records were pretty powerful, probably better than the Runaways, who I've never heard. Bad Reputation could be the Ramones. I really dug her power chord remake of Sly Stone's Everyday People, too. This stuff was on MTV all the time back then, especially Crimson and Clover. Billy Idol covered Tommy Shondell also with Moni Moni and I Love Rock and Roll. There was also Pete Shelley of the Buzzcocks with Homo Sapien, which seemed kind of punk, but was really quite new wave in retrospect. Lords of the New Church, Stiv Bators from the Dead Boys and Brian James from the Damned, were more on a goth tip like Susie and the Banshees. Spellbound is a great song that got a fair amount of MTV play back then. Or Sisters of Mercy or The Damned, neither of whom made it onto MTV too much, although The Damned's Captain Sensible had a novelty song, What, that was on MTV pretty frequently, consisting of little besides, they said Captain, I said what? Kevin Rowland, who cut a scorching 77 single with the Killjoys, donned some overalls, corralled a couple of violinists, formed Dexy's Midnight Runners, and scored a hit with Come On Eileen, a song I still find irritating as hell. There was also Bow Wow Wow, managed by Malcolm McLaren, whose tribal new wave holds up pretty well. At least C30, C60, C90 Go does. I Want Candy was another video I used to look for. In essence, the stars of 77 Punk, the big party that I'd missed, weren't faring much better musically than the stars of 60s classic rock were in the 80s, at least compared to past glories. As one book title put it, it was like punk never happened. And this is from, it's got to be New York City Rhythm in My Life. I was 13 the first time I heard the Velvet Underground and Nico, and it gave me a headache. But I continued to play it every day for the next 3 months. That started my love affair with New York rock and New York itself, which was only 40 minutes away from Short Hills, New Jersey, where me and my family lived. As a kid, I'd bought into my parents' attitude of, it's a nice place to visit, but you wouldn't want to live there. My family would go to the theater or a museum and then get the hell out. My mother had lived in New York 10 years before getting married and would go back every chance she got, usually with me and my brother in tow. I always enjoyed these excursions, but throughout my childhood, I couldn't understand why anyone would want to live in an apartment and not a house with a backyard. That all changed. I got into the New York Dolls soon after, got the Ramones' It's Alive and Richard Hell's Destiny Street for my 14th birthday. I remember looking at the photo on the cover of Destiny Street of Hell playing bass on the bed in his apartment with his chick in the background, wanting a New York apartment of my own. I doubt that I had a concept of the East Village at that point. His guitarist, Robert Quinn, also played with Lou Reed and became my New York guitar idol. In my mid-teens, I once spotted him walking up Fifth Avenue. As a kid, I kept wondering why I never ran into John and Yoko on the subway, so things were looking up. The original CBGB's Max's scenes weren't that old back then, but already legendary. I picked up a copy of New York Rocker, its final issue, at my local record store, the Record Mill. The scene actually warranted its own monthly publication. I pored over the pages. The cover story was Hoboken, a model pop community with the Individuals and the Bongos. Years later, I would see the Individuals' Glenn Morrow taking his kids to school every day while I waited for the bus on Washington Street. There was so much going on only 40 minutes from where I lived, but all after midnight. I would look at the ads in the Village Voice religiously, week after week, to see who was playing at CBGB's or at Folk City, but I was still too provincial to really go to shows. Hoboken had meant little to me other than the last stop on the commuter train before you changed to the PATH subway into Manhattan. But the rocker piece hit me to Maxwell's, which boasted a homegrown, underground rock atmosphere for urban tastes without the pretensions. I had a cousin living there too who loaned me Patti Smith's Horses and a bunch of jazz albums. I'd read Robert Palmer's Pop Life column in the New York Times every week, where he would talk about all kinds of local music from Lydia Lunch to Lamont Young to Grandmaster Flash. His appreciation of everyone from Lydia to Duane Allman echoed my own, and he was very adroit at placing all of it in a continuum that was easy to relate to. Around 1985, he did a column called Electric Guitars, where he talked about Glenn Branca, Sonic Youth, and Live Skull, and I immediately bought their records and the Tell Us All Guitars cassette that they all appeared on. That cassette was a watershed for me because it collected that whole scene, plus people like Elliot Sharp and Arda Lindsay, the Butthole Surfers, Blixa Bargeld, Steve Albini, and Bob Mould, making the connection between underground rock, noise rock, and downtown art music. I was also getting interested in the sort of stuff that New Music Distribution Service carried, hearing a lot of it on Tim Page's afternoon music show on WNYC, and would go over to their loft at 500 Broadway once in a while and buy records, or order them through the mail, ranging from Philip Glass and Steve Reich type stuff to Christian Marclay, Fred Frith, and other improvisers. They all lived in New York. I remember going to see Rhys Chatham at the Kitchen and standing behind Lee Ronaldo in line for the bathroom. I'd read Thurston Moore's open letter to Christgau in The Voice, and I dug that Sonic Youth seemed to be into the same hardcore and rock bands I was into, and stuff like Steve Reich and Lamont Young at the same time. I wanted to combine art music and rock music like them and Chatham and Branca, and the only place anyone seemed to be doing that was New York. New York music had nothing to do with cock rock, boogie rock, the Grateful Dead, Styx, REO Speedwagon, or Kansas. None of those bands ever came from New York. It was almost punk by definition. I was a big fan of Cop and Raping a Slave by the Swans. Those records were brutal and scary and seemed to define New York rock circa mid-'80s for me. The four people on the back cover of Cop didn't look like people I'd want to hang out with, and that was cool. It was the same thing as that picture of Joey Ramone in 1988. They looked threatening. When I got to college, my freshman roommate had a copy of No New York, which was a revelation. This is where the Swans and Sonic Youth were coming from. The cover was like a grid of mugshots. The musicians all looked like criminals, as did J.D. Doherty holding a switchblade on the back cover of Horses, or the Ramones in their teenage gang getup. It would probably seem tame even to a teenager now, but my very impressionable younger self, it was intimidating and exciting. I borrowed the first Suicide album from a friend in college, the most assaultive New York group of them all. I would play Frankie Teardrop endlessly, which I rated right up there with Taxi Driver in terms of capturing the sense of violence and dread in 70s New York. The grindingly minimal music not only seemed to melt down Philip Glass and the Stooges into one, but to also replicate the industrial sounds of the city itself. And then there were the stories of actual violence by the performers at shows. Alan Vega from Suicide locking the doors of the Mercer Arts Center and lunging into the audience wielding a dagger. James Chance kicking a pregnant woman in the stomach, which prompted a physical attack on Chance by the Voice's Robert Christgau. Lydia Lunch throwing her pick at a New York rocker critic's glasses at a Teenage Jesus set ended, and Gigi Allen's legendary anarchic gig at the Cat Club, witnessed by several of my friends at school. Throughout college, I kept reading The Voice and Gerard Cosloy's Conflict magazine, which kept me in touch with what was happening in the New York rock scene. Pussy Galore came out, and they were big at the college radio station. We tried to get them to play at our school, but it never happened. They also looked like badasses, although in truth they were liberal arts students like us. In the summer of 1989, Rudolph Gray, who I'd first heard on the telecassette and had interviewed on college radio and for a magazine called Blacktacom, asked me to play bass with him and drummer David Linton in Thurston's Rock and Roll Circus. And a few months later, Love Child, my band at school, played at CBGB's for the first time. I was finally taking part in a New York rock scene I'd fantasized about for nearly 10 years. Eventually, I met and played with many of the people who were on No New York, the people who were in the Swans, Quine, even went out with a woman who'd also dated Richard Hell, not the one on the cover of Destiny Street, but I met her too, and joined a band with Rick Brown, who I'd first seen pictured with V-Effect in that issue of New York Rocker some 10 years earlier. In the 1988 documentary Put Blood in the Music, there were segments on Sonic Youth, John Zorn, Ambitious Lovers, Hugo Largo, and lots of talking heads like Lenny Kaye, Glenn Branca, Vernon Reid, Gerard Cosloy, and Lydia Lunch, all discussing the New York rock scene of the 70s and 80s. People were still talking about the sound of the subway and the energy of the streets influencing the music, all those cliches, but it was really true. The music was still aggressive and arty, and New York was still trashy, even as the 80s art boom began to transform Soho and rents in the East Village began to rise. At one point, Karen Finley, the performance artist known for smearing her body with chocolate among other shock tactics, says something to the effect of, "We have to keep making art to keep the Upper East Siders out of the neighborhood," i.e. downtown. For a long time, they did. When the music was still noisy and violent, when the musicians still wore all black and had drug habits, this effectively scared away the squares. The streets weren't safe, and the music reflected that. So what happened in the 90s? Rudy Giuliani became mayor and totally cleaned up the streets, of homeless people, of crime, of drinking beer on a stoop. It was practically martial law, but suddenly chains started opening here, like Kmart and Starbucks. Avenue B became the site of boutiques and cafes instead of drug dens. 42nd Street went from all porno theaters to all Disney. And the East Village and Soho were crowded with tourists all the time. TV shows like Seinfeld and Friends confirmed the idea that New York was now not only safe to visit, but to live in. A friend recently commented that people used to move to New York to hang out with Allen Ginsberg and Lou Reed. Now they move here because they watch Friends. Or, better yet, to watch Friends with Lou Reed. Rents skyrocketed. When I arrived at junior high, high school, and even college, I was told that each used to be wild, but the new principal or dean was cracking down. Moving to New York, although slightly just pre-Giuliani, continued this pattern. And what were the bands of the 90s in New York? Versus, Yo La Tengo, Magnetic Fields, Girls vs. Boys, Love Child, Sleepyhead, Chavez, Luna, Pony, Blonde Redhead, Railroad Jerk, Cell. None of them were junkies. Hell, most weren't even drunks. They were suburban and a little slobby, but essentially well scrubbed. Some of them even played sports or wore Izod shirts. They were approachable after a show. Despite the use of distortion, their musical roots lay in new wave, not no wave. The music and attitude were not assaultive. Bob Bannister once typified the movement as bands no one from Pussy Galore would ever go to see, although Julie Cafert saw Love Child a few times, while Ann Marlowe opined that these bands looked like they were going to the office when they got on stage, as opposed to Cop Shoe Cop, who trashed their gear after their first song. Codeine was as heavy and slow as the Swans, but melodic and normal looking. Two New York bands made inroads commercially. Helmet, who like Living Colour before them, proved that a CBGB's heavy metal band could have a hit, although unlike Living Colour, they started on an indie label, Amphetamine Reptile. And Saul Coughing, who stood firmly in the Talking Heads quirk rock tradition. D-Generation's members came out of the early 80s hardcore scene and desperately aspired to be the new New York Dolls. If making two major label albums that nobody bought counts, they succeeded. Otherwise, they were more like Gotham's answer to Hanoi Rocks, a decade too late. They also ran a club series called Green Door, which was themed around the 70s CBGB's Max's scene, a noble sentiment but too retro to be relevant. Jonathan Fire Eater rocked a better Dolls rip, but the singer's constant mugging was unbearable to watch on stage. As for their overall image, the Backstreet Boys, drawn by Charles Addams, might be one way of describing it. The Unsane and Surgery and Prong and all those other East Village scum rock bands had to be reckoned with, but most of them came out of the late 80s, just post Pussy Galore, and were essentially harmless. Speaking of which, where were the 80s bands? Lydia Lunch moved out. The Swans redid a Joy Division song and got on MTV. John Spencer formed the initially powerful but ultimately cartoonish Blues Explosion. Neil Haggerty and Jennifer Harrima's Royal Trucks were originally in the New York noise tradition, somewhat, but moved around the country and emerged as the true inheritors of the Meat Puppets' vision of fucked up classic rock. Or is that classic fucked up rock? Arthur Lindsay concentrated on Brazilian sounds and production, then rediscovered skronk in the grunge era. The Feelies broke up, again. So did Das Damen. White Zombie became best-selling major label meddlers. CBGB still had a good booking policy in the early 90s, but more recently became home to an endless supply of shitty bar bands, usually 5 to 7 a night. It seems more and more likely that the CBGB's Max's Kansas City scene of the mid to late 70s, whose influence was still felt through the entirety of the 80s, was much like the Athens scene of the early 80s or the Seattle scene of the late 80s, a spontaneous combination of people in cheap rents in a specific time and place that produced a rock scene that was hyped as the next big thing and then mined by the media and major labels, which of course ruins it. In New York, as the neighborhoods became friendlier, so did the bands. As the streets became safer, so did the music. Or was it the other way around? Not that the music was necessarily bad. A lot of it is great. But what does it have to do with New York? Just at the onset of malls, multiplexes, chain retail outlets, and the like threatened New York's anti-hick identity, the New York rock scene's anti-hick identity has eroded too. Just like New Yorkers are no longer thought of as rude or cold, New York music isn't that way either.